We're going to introduce ourselves. I'll just say to begin with that, yes, I learned this morning I was not year one, I was year two of Biotech Showcase, but it really has grown. It's been a very rewarding partnership for us. I'll also correct, I joke now, I've aged out of being a partner, I'm a senior counsel, but I also consider myself the oldest venture capital and emerging company lawyer in the United States. And Art may be up there with me on the venture side. And I specialize in life sciences companies, particularly biotech, and I'm based in Covington's New York office. Han?
Okay. Hi, my name is Han Lee. I work in the Corporate Development Ventures Group at Astrazeneca. There's three main remits for my group. One is M&A, second is strategic transformative deals, and also third is handling the equity portfolio for AstraZeneca.
Hi, I'm Marian Nakata. I'm with JJDC, Johnson & Johnson's corporate venture arm, and I'm based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and do farm investments for the East Coast.
Hi, I'm John Norris with Silicon Valley Bank. We work with lots of innovative healthcare companies from early stage all the way up through public on the banking and debt side, and I manage the healthcare venture relationships for the bank.
I'm Art Pappas, the managing partner at Pappas Ventures. We're a life science venture capital firm based in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We invest across the United States, and most of our investments are in early stage therapeutics.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Alex Zisson. I'm a partner at H.I.G Capital, and we have a healthcare fund within H.I.G Capital that does the broad range of startup to late stage, all therapeutic areas. I'm more of a biopharmaceutical guy personally, but we do everything within the healthcare space.
So we have a treat because we're starting off with John, who, being with Silicon Valley Bank, Silicon Valley Bank has just released its 2017 recap and forecast for 2018 report. I think one can reach it online, but I'll let him tell you the logistics. But he's going to summarize some of the highlights of that report, sort of as an overview to begin with. John?
Great, thanks. Yeah, we're really excited to release the report. We do that twice a year, once in July and then once right before JP Morgan. And if you just go on to Biotech Showcase, thank you. If you go to svb.com and right at the front page or enter my name in and the report comes up, it's free. And what we really try and do is summarize what's going on in the industry from a venture perspective. And I think I'm going to share a little bit about what we see on the healthcare side and specifically within biotech. Talk a little bit about the fundraising and what's happened on that side. What's going on with biotech Series A, who are the most active investors in the sector, where are those dollars being deployed, and then we'll talk just briefly about exits, IPOs, and M&As before we get into the discussion. And so, maybe broadly speaking, if you look at healthcare venture fundraising, we look at that from a U.S. perspective, look at all U.S. venture funds that are raised and try and allocate what percentage of those funds are going to go into healthcare. And this year was a record at $9.1 billion that was fundraised in 2017. And that doesn't include most of the corporate venture folks. It doesn't include the crossovers. It doesn't include any folks that are investing OUS and doing some investing in the US. But what it means is that there is a lot of capital out in the sector. And I think that's a function of one, a very active exit environment, which has been very good for investors. And two, a really fast pace of investing. And we're seeing these venture funds that typically were more 3 to 4 years between fundraises, now 2 to 2.5 years are going out and raising their next fund. And that really has led to a record-setting investment into the biopharma sector. Lots of deals are being done, lots of dollars. We're seeing round sizes really skyrocket. And so, again, this year was a record. And if you look specifically within biopharma on the Series A side, $2.6, $2.7 billion just invested into biopharma Series A in the US. It's just staggering numbers, and we're seeing those rounds, especially in Q4 this year. How many people saw these 50 to 100, 150, $200 million Series A deals being done? And really, I think it's very interesting to see, one, the sheer size of these rounds, which frankly are sort of Series A and B meshed together. But two, to see the corporate folks being very active in this sector, and about 1 out of every 3 biotech Series A deals has a corporate as part of the Series A syndicate. So we're seeing lots of investment in that area. And when you sort of look broadly as to who are the most active investors in biotech, it's the top 20 list it's a split between the corporate and the traditional venture folks. On the traditional venture folks, you have the Orbimeds and the Novos and the NEAs and the Vivos and the Sofanova Ventures. But on the corporate side, you have Pfizer, Celgene, J&J. And you're seeing some other folks come in, like a Google Ventures. Google Ventures was extremely active over the last 2 years, investing in therapeutics companies. So very interesting dynamic. And what's nice is that not only do you have that $9.1 billion that's been fundraised, but you have all this ancillary capital from the corporate folks really going into these companies to support. And when you look at where those dollars are going, oncology really leads the road. So it's oncology and platform and neuro companies. We saw a slight decrease in investment in orphan rare, which I think is really interesting, and actually a decrease in sort of crossover interest in orphan rare, which I think is going to be very interesting to see what happens in 2018. And so maybe with that as an overview, we'll just talk a little bit about exits, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. When I look at venture-backed M&A and biopharma, it was a little bit of a down year this year, and I think that was really a function of, one, an open IPO market, and then two, I think there were still questions about repatriation and where things were going to go in terms of appetite to acquire early-stage companies. I think there's no doubt that, in my mind, that big biopharma has totally outsourced R to venture-backed biopharma companies. And that's going to continue. That's continues to happen, and that's going to, again, spur M&A coming up in 2018. But when you do look at the exits that did happen in 2017, 50% of the venture-backed biopharma M&A were preclinical or phase 1 deals. So early stage M&A continues to happen in the sector, and the dollar amounts are fairly strong. You're seeing $170 to $200 million upfront, total deal value $400 to $500 million, and that's continued to be really solid. What's super interesting to me is I look at the time to exit. I think that's a really interesting metric when you're looking at M&A, and the median time to exit of the venture-backed biopharma M&A that we saw this year was 3.5 years from the close of Series A to exit. And so when you think about why these venture funds are able to raise such funds so quickly, it's the sheer pace of exits in the sector. And so, maybe turning to IPO lastly, the very interesting metric, one, we sort of had the same amount of biopharma IPOs as we had in 2016, which was great, but we saw a surge in the pre-money valuation on these IPOs. And I define the pre-money valuation, if you sort of look at the market cap at IPO, you subtract whatever the proceeds are, and that's kind of like the pre-money IPO value. That pre-money median value was almost $300 million, which was about $100 million better than anything else during this 5-year cycle. So really what that pointed to was, these big deals that were crossover-led at pretty high valuations were going out at up rounds with a $300 million pre-money. And so that's really good news for the market, and I think, in the end, that's going to really spur a good IPO market next year. I think the last thing on the IPO side is, if you include orphan rare and oncology IPOs, that was 65% of the IPOs for 2017. So a major focus on those two areas, and especially oncology. And again, I think that's a function of the crossover investors, which are a lot of those public-minded investors that are investing opportunistically in the private sector, really setting the stage and making these large mezzanine Series A, Series B bets in these companies, and then quickly taking them public. And it's very interesting when you actually look at what the time to exit from those mezzanine rounds are for IPOs. It's anywhere from 6 to 9 months. And in 2017, there were 8 companies that crossovers invested in 2017 that also went public in 2017. Just really amazing, fast time from Series A to IPO. And then finally, maybe we sort of go into the prediction side. I do think when we're working off record numbers like we saw in the fundraising and the investing in company side, seeing a little bit, I think we're going to see a decline in that number, but really it's a small decline, and it sort of is going to fit in what we saw in 2014 to 16, which is going to be maybe 15-20% off in terms of the fundraising, because we saw some of the big firms like NEA and Claris raise some really big funds. I think fundraising is still going to be strong, but it's not going to set a record. And I think on the investment side, I really do think there's going to be a slight slowing of investment pace. I think when you see exits come down a little bit, like we saw this year, and M&A being down a little bit, I think we're going to see a slightly slower pace of investment, which is, again, within the 5-year period that we're looking at, very healthy, but just a little bit down. Maybe with that, we'll turn to the panel.
So that was a lot, and that was great. And when I listened to that, I think if I'd heard that any other year, I think this is a giant, dangerous bubble. But I don't think it's a bubble. We had sort of talked about some questions. This wasn't on the list, but it strikes me as the first one I'd like to ask. Is why isn't this a bubble? Is it because there's really substantive innovation going on? Is it because what's driving this that doesn't make it a bubble? And it's really for the whole panel to sort of respond to.
Well, I don't look at it as a bubble, the reason I don't is the money that's being raised in a major way is being raised by smart money. We got really knowledgeable people putting this money to work. The innovation curve has been the best we've ever seen it, and the novelty of the science and the profound implications of medicine to cure something is pretty profound. And I don't see that slacking off. There are issues in there that we should address, but I think we're in for a continued robust period of innovation development. Biotechnology is going to be the biggest impact on mankind, that's been said before, that we'll see, and it will continue. That's my view.
And I think it's also both not just in the biology, meaning immuno-oncology and areas like that, but also the convergence of the successive technologies, meaning CAR-T, gene editing, a variety, oligonucleotides, antisense that have been, a lot of work has been gone on to get to this point where they're finally making these breakthroughs. And so the question is, what are the applications for all of these technologies?
So Alex, on the venture side, why don't you?
Yeah, I do think there's some good characteristics of a bubble here. I think it's important to disaggregate the science and the fundamental progress from valuations and also from funding. I think the bubble's not on the science side at all, or the medical need. It's on the valuations. I think I read the other day there were 700 PD-1 trials clinical trials going on. And so you think about how many winners can come out of that, who can be a clear winner. Companies that are starting phase 1, phase 2 trials right now, by the time they get to the market, who knows what the standard of care is going to be and how your data will stack up. If you look at all the companies that are public, let alone private, I don't want to say the valuations assume perfection for all of them, but there's a lot of room to go down, I think. So, and especially I get worried when I don't hear a lot of people talking about a bubble, when people are thinking, oh yeah, this is going pretty well. We're on a good streak here. I think, and broadly speaking, I think the market itself is a little toppy, and expectations are high. I think the fact that so many big venture funds have been raised, and so many public companies have raised money and have huge balance sheets. Admittedly, some of them spend money pretty quickly. I actually think that inoculates the market for a little bit, for a couple of years, as far as companies being formed. A lot of these huge rounds, the money is going in over time and it's sort of already reserved. So I think even if you see public companies start to take a hit on valuation, maybe quickly, maybe a slow decline. I joined Hamburg Quist in 1991, so I've seen sort of cycles go both ways, depending on usually external events to the field. There's always a lag effect. I think there'll actually be a pretty big lag effect if indeed the market slows down in a big way for valuations.
Yeah, maybe just totally agree with that, Alex. And I think maybe just one other note, and what concerns me a little bit is, as I mentioned before, is the sheer size of some of these rounds. And that capital is going into these companies, and the question is, does that amount of capital at that valuation preclude these companies from exiting early? And that's really not something that we can answer right now. And will acquirers, change how they go after those companies? When you have an open IPO market, that allows the optionality for M&A to be strong. If the IPO market is not as strong, what happens there? But really, again, so much capital into a company, and they have really interesting data. At what price are investors willing to look at an M&A? And do they sort of price themselves out by having such a large round size?
So going back to sort of the outlook for venture funds, and given these large funds with enormous amounts of capital. Art, you're a small VC. You're in a strategic area that is doing early stage companies. Does that affect the Research Triangle Park environment? Does it affect your opportunities? And how do you look at addressing the market in this context?
Well, our fund, we manage about $520 million, and our average fund size is about $120 million per fund. So we think it's the right size to do our early stage investing. But we don't invest just in Research Triangle Park. We're based there. A third of our capital goes out on the West Coast, a third goes up in the Northeast, and then we target what we call the undercapitalized markets from Florida up to Quebec. And that's been an important part of our strategy over our 24 years of investing. So that's allowed us to look at deals that these large syndicates in the Northeast and up in the West don't participate in, and they rely on us to kind of develop a company and bring it forward. One of the transactions that John was referring to was a company we started out of Indianapolis from Lilly called CoLucid. We took it public, and then it was acquired back by Lilly earlier last year for $1 billion. So it was a big transaction in that regard. However, the sensitivity in early stage investing that I think all the venture firms have is two things. One, sorting out the science projects from sustainable enterprises that can give your investors venture returns. And the other part, which is critical, is that we have to syndicate. The cost of capital is such, or the capital required to move something forward through a phase 2B and then into a phase 3 is a large capital pool. So we need to syndicate. In fact, our biggest syndicating partner is, in fact, NEA. We do many of our deals with them. And even though we're small, we play an important role in the diversification of the cap structure and in the voting thresholds.
And are they in from the Series A level on?
In some cases they are. We just completed one Series A, large one, that they're in with us with a couple of other small investors.
So Alex, your portfolio, I think, for the firm is a little broader than that. What is your outlook on venture investing and the dynamics given the background information?
Yeah, no, I'd say it's pretty similar to Art's. I think it's, again, important to disaggregate. You know, you look at John's report, there's a huge amount of money raised, but I haven't seen a pie chart, but so much of that is going to early stage, you know, Flagship, Polaris, Atlas, Third Rock, Column, Arch. I mean, there's some NEA, or there's some guys who are more diversified, but and within those early stage funds, a huge percentage is going to orphan and oncology, and especially IO, you know, maybe gene therapy, RNA, you know, something like antisense, something like that. So those areas are pretty frothy, we think. But I think you start going geographically outside, you know, Cambridge, Mass, and the Bay Area, especially in hot markets. It just becomes so easy to stay local for venture guys. And I think in other areas, whether it's other therapeutics, we think medical device is actually way underfunded right now. They went through a really rough period, but we think that pendulum is swinging back. So, you know, other areas of biopharmaceuticals, drug delivery, generic type things, products that have failed, but everyone's thrown it out, but we think there's a pony in there somewhere. I think those valuations are still pretty reasonable.
Yeah. And really the whole move, which will come, I think, in part with the corporates, is this clinical simulation. How do we strip back the cost associated with clinical trials so we get an answer sooner than later? And look, Pfizer's announcement to do venture in artificial intelligence speaks volumes, I think, about where some of this may go.
Yeah,
Don't you think, Marion? I mean,
Yeah, I think the notion of becoming more efficient, and even people are discussing how we need to collaborate maybe better together in terms of combinations, because I think one of the other, I don't know if you call it a bubble, but with all of the new therapies that would be used in combination with checkpoint inhibitors, for example, to your point, is it's very much duplication of effort for everyone to have their own PD-1, and the question of how you even get the patients to enroll in those studies. So, one idea would be similar to HIV drugs, where the combinations occur and the pricing of those combinations occurs with companies that have the separate pieces of the combination. I think that there's going to have to be some sort of way that we're going to have to work together. Elsewise, I think the rational combinations for some of those drugs aren't going to be able to get to patients because of those inefficiencies. So it's slightly different, off topic,
No,
but I think
yeah, but it plays in nicely, because if you think about what happened with the SNP technologies, the whole SNP consortium came together because no one could figure out how to commercialize, and every pharma company was doing their own thing.
Yeah.
And you had the FDA that said, gosh, you still got to run a parallel trial alongside of the SNP data.
Right.
And that was a big transformation for the industry.
Right. I mean, and to the point about information, we made a very large investment in Grail, which is that was financed over to the tune of over $1 billion. It's a private company that is looking at circulating cell-free tumor DNA and doing deep sequencing to identify mutations. So there's a whole range of corporates that have also participated in funding Grail, and the idea here is to be able to profile tens of thousands of patients, to be able to get the kind of data that you will need to be predictive. And for us, we're very, very interested in early disease detection. So that's the whole biomarker signature or whatever. And then also, but then you would need a therapy. And so the notion that you could actually get now novel targets also out of this information is why it was important for us to participate in that. But that big data piece, we think, is really going to drive sort of potentially new medicines that will deal with cancer much earlier.
Yeah, and I think there are also the data registries that are growing up. There are whole companies that are creating data registries that collect enough information and sell it to pharma or license it to pharma to use, and also companies that are coming up with just the development of tissue that will enable faster R&D by pharma companies. So they're the enablers. That's one of the, raison d'etre for some of the companies that are here now, is that they're creating technologies or data technologies that'll help pharma develop drugs.
Yeah, no, I agree with what Marion said. I think when I look at the portfolio for AstraZeneca and how we make some of our decisions in terms of which trials do we want to fund, which ones actually get funded even internally, when you have a data set with a marker there, and probably stating the obvious, it's a huge advantage because now you can really pinpoint how many patients you really need in that trial. You get rid of a lot of the noise. And I think even if you look at some of the big drugs that AstraZeneca has launched over the last couple of years, Tagrisso, Lynparza. Lynparza was a drug that actually, until our recent CEO, Pascal, came on, was kind of not going anywhere. And once they looked at the data and they saw a signal in specific patient subpopulations, it's really opening up that PARP space. And so I think, yeah, if biotechs come up with an idea where they see a drug that's maybe not showing the right signal on these big, large trials, but they see a signature which is prepared, which they know about, which maybe we might be missing. That's actually a great opportunity. And right now, AstraZeneca is one of our big, I would say, not problems, but it's actually kind of a rich man's problem, is we have too much stuff in our R&D pipeline. And, a large portion of my time is figuring out, hey, does this make sense to spin out? Should we propose spinning this out, or should we try to see if we can rationalize it internally?
And let's talk about spin-outs for a minute. That's where I wanted to head next anyway, with the two of you representing J&J and AZ, the phenomenon of spinning out, going through your own portfolios, determining what to spin out, how to get that funded, what the opportunities are for people who are looking for companies to start. How do you find who's going to start them? Do they come from within? Do they come from without? Maybe you can both talk to that for a bit.
Well, the two categories. One is just the pure out divestitures, in which case that's an out license, and we don't necessarily, if they're completely non-strategic, and so that's different. But the spin out concept is if we feel as if that we want some sort of relationship with the new co, whether or not it be we put equity in it, we put people in it, we get equity for, the license in lieu of I guess cash. And so those are and we've done those historically over time when we have things that are investable by folks on the outside. And so it's and sometimes it goes with the executives, entrepreneurs that spin out. In other instances, there are people that approach us, either venture firms or entrepreneurs that are looking for externalizing. Sometimes we want hard rights back to that, and if that is appropriate, then we get those. Other times when we do those pitches and nobody wants to fund it because that upside is capped for the VCs, then we have to go to Plan B. I mean, and we get very creative. One of the ones that we did was a publicly traded company, TradeCon, and we put an oncology asset into that with a pipe, and then we have, and they were developing the asset, and we do have rights back. It's an option back, but that was, so we've done it with any number of creative structures.
I think it's a similar situation in AstraZeneca. I think AstraZeneca, over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years, has been much more active in spin-outs. We actually have a website called Open Innovation where we have molecules that we are open to out-licensing to venture capitalists, and so that's one avenue in which we get pings about possibly spin-outs, not spin-outs, but more like new codes formed off molecules. But in terms of spin-outs at AstraZeneca, that's a lot of those usually have teams associated with those spin-outs, and usually that's actually developed internally. So it could be from, for instance, I could be eating lunch one day and have a conversation with a buddy whose program didn't get funded internally. And we would, come up with an idea. Is this something that has a team associated with it? Is this something that, venture capitalists would be interested in? And we can go from there. I think AstraZeneca, especially my group's a little bit more unique because it's not just, we just don't focus on equity. We actually have more of a corporate development remit, so we have a larger view into the portfolio at AstraZeneca. And so as these spin-outs occur, it's usually the first one that occurs with the management team that takes a while, get them comfortable with it. But over the last few years at AstraZeneca, I think this idea of spin-outs and creating value in areas that might not be core to us with assets that can be developed in areas that aren't core to us is actually taking hold. And we're seeing this occur, I think, over the last year and a half. I think we've had about 2 or 3 spin-outs from AstraZeneca.
One other comment is the venture firms like those assets because we have the data integrity piece is something that we within Janssen have very high standards, and for anything that is going to be used to make a decision, all of that data is audited all the way back to source data, the calculation. So they really like the concept that what they're getting is not something that they have to reproduce or vet, and that's one of the reasons these assets are attractive.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And the other thing is if you have a team associated with that asset, I mean, as soon as it's funded, that company is just hitting the ground and running. You save, 6 months at least of not having to recruit a team. And so when we have a team associated with an asset that's what we call big pharma vetted, we have a lot of VCs being very interested in those types of situations.
Yeah, from the other side of the table, I think for entrepreneurs or companies in the audience, I agree with everything Marion and Hans said. You get super high quality data, very complete data sets compared to what most of our companies generate. I think you have to be a little careful when you think about what assets you're getting as to how you raise money around it, because the flip side, and we've done one, we have a brain cancer drug, but I think it's really important that you have a story to tell of why it became available, because if it's just, hey, Han and a bunch of Astra guys prioritize their products, and we know they have more products in-house than they can develop. But if you're like, hey, we had our top 20, this one's number 21, you know that there's 20 products that they were more excited about for one reason or another. If there's some story, like for ours, this drug was originally a Marion Merrill Dow drug, and then the Herx came in, and then it was Aventis, and then it was Sanofi, and it sort of got dropped, and you can sort of tell a story around that. If it's a drug that was originally developed for a bigger indication, doesn't look good for that, but it looks good for a smaller indication, but that's not small enough to prioritize, something like that. I think that's easier than just saying, hey, we think this drug looks pretty good. Astra had it number 21, but it's our number 1 drug. You just have to be a little bit careful thinking how you're going to position it for fundraising.
Yeah, and you're exactly right, because I think, most of the spin-outs at least that I've been associated with, have been in really two buckets. One is AstraZeneca is not focused in that therapeutic area anymore, and so one of those was Entasis, a big one of the spin-outs we did a couple of years ago. Secondly, you touched on it, is maybe AstraZeneca has three core areas. It's going to be respiratory, oncology, and cardiovascular. And indications we go after have to be a certain scale. And so if it doesn't meet that threshold, and possibly if it's not in those one of those three therapeutic areas, we're actually probably not going to look at the possibility of, hey, can this be developed in outside those areas, especially like orphan disease. AstraZeneca is not in orphan diseases, right? And so when you have, for instance, scientists who know those pathways, that pathway really well, and knows, hey, yeah, I'm trying to develop it for instance, respiratory, because AstraZeneca is interested in respiratory, but that's actually this is a great pathway for orphan. I think in those situations, I think those types of assets are the ones that I think we would actually focus on for venture capitalists, because we also understand that if it's the 50th asset and it's the one with the worst PK profile, it's going to be a very hard sell.
So one of the things that's come up in several panels this week is pricing, and when you talk about 50 PDLs or in development or whatever, and I haven't heard anybody here talk about pricing yet as a consideration in connection with deciding whether to invest in today's world. So I would like the panel to address that issue as well, and what you're thinking both from the VC and the corporate and the non-corporate VC side.
Well, we probably look at price today earlier than we ever have, even in early stage investing. However, at least in our shop, our approach is if we're going to invest in things that are first in class, best in class, novel biology, dealing with a cure, unmet medical need, then whatever's going to happen 10 years down the road, 5 years down the road on pricing is going to be a practical solution we're going to have to deal with for society. And we don't overthink that in that regard. But we won't do a generic. So we won't do a Me Too. We won't do something that only modestly or moderately changes the safety or efficacy profile. It's got to be pretty profound. That makes it easy to defer the topic of price, but it isn't the full price.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue for us, too. If you go back and look at our investment memos that we write, 10 years ago, there's maybe like a page on reimbursement broadly, and now it's can be half the report. And I think we're the same way. I mean, you have to have some real value add if you want to command premium pricing, or if your strategy is the opposite, say we're going to come in at a big discount because cost of goods or we're late or whatever. I mean, that's the plan all along. It can be reasonable. I also encourage companies to think about it, like Art said, early, but also it's not just pricing, it's the whole sort of reimbursement pathway. There are going to be step edits, there are going to be prior authorizations, what else is going to be generic, because it's not totally just what price you can charge. It's kind of how you fit into the overall price structure for that category. And when you're trying to think ahead, especially for an early stage product, it can be pretty tough to have confidence in your forecast for pricing 7 or 8 years out.
Yeah, and just put it on the M&A hat as valuations for companies are kind of what I would say exploding right now. When we sit back and we're looking at these opportunities, pricing is actually a big thing. You model out what you think the valuation for the company is, but then all of a sudden you see this company being valued at, what you think is 30% more than what you assume. And you look at let's say it's an IO product. You look at the IO market right now, all these trials going on. It's not like the healthcare budget's going to increase in the U.S. Right? So there aren't going to be 50 winners. There's going to be a couple winners in there. And so trying to rationalize all that, even with putting my M&A hat on, it's tough. And normally, when you have a product, preclinical or phase 1 product, to spend so much time on pricing now versus before, it's much different.
So there are a lot of very early stage companies here. This isn't an early stage company conference, but there are a number of companies that have done a seed round at best and are looking for A. And in today's world, with the fact that we have very large funds that are putting very large amounts to work per investment, or we have funds that are spinning out their own startups and don't go outside of their own group for that, what are the opportunities for early stage good companies who are not in the spin out from big venture fund mode?
Let me go back to this thing about these large rounds for a second, because what's prompting that is the fact that you want a diversified mix of investors in your syndicate. So if you bring NEA in, their minimum that they're going to do is $10 million or $15 million. You bring RA Capital in, it's going to be that. And therefore, you get to a large number if you want 2 or 3 investors and you think you can get to the public market sooner and you need a crossover investor. So it's accommodating the plan in that regard. But I'll tell you, what's happened really positively over the last decade, in my view, in biotech, and particularly for early stage companies, is the rigor and the discipline the corporate pharma, or just pharma in general, has brought to the whole understanding of IND enabling, what a solid phase 1 should look like, what a solid phase 2 should look like. And we've gotten away in a very constructive way from biotech phase 2s that had to be redone by the pharma people when they acquired. And that has been pretty profound. It's cost more, but it's been pretty profound in the value add equation, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And therefore, if you could raise a small amount of money in a diversified way and get through IND enabling, do it. It's a step up you might have when you do your Series B. But then you have to think about the overall strategy for fundraising, including the public markets, and who's going to be there to support that IPO, because the IPO is a financing event today. So there's a lot of things to think about in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, there's an opportunity for people outside of immuno-oncology and orphan. I think, if you have good science, a good product profile idea, and to Art's point earlier, if it's not sort of a me too or a modest benefit, if you have a chance to be a real difference maker in clinical practice, you can find investors. But again, to Art's point, it's less sexy, there's less people out there, it's not top of mind. So I think if you have an immuno-oncology idea, and you're like, geez, it may take $100 million to really prove this out, in a pivotal trial, that's not a problem. If you're in hyperlipidemia or cholesterol or hypertension or some area that's not really that well funded, that's a tougher business model. So I think if you're outside a sexy area, your chances are way enhanced if you can say, hey, for $25 million, we can do this killer clinical trial that'll really be predictive of a phase 2. It's the same endpoint as the phase 3. It's the same patient population. It's the same duration of therapy. It's going to be a very predictive trial. And that's how you start getting the big step ups. That's how you can go public in a non-sexy area.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in on the Series A side, and I think we did talk a lot about these really large Series A rounds, but if I do look at the Series A data in the U.S. and you say it's about 160 Series A deals where you're raising at least $2 million, the median dollar value for Series A was around $7 million. So it's not like the only thing that's happening are these $30 to $50 or $70 million Series A. There's a lot of early stage activity happening. I think you are seeing a lot of individual investors and a lot of smaller investors that are making early stage bets and getting it to a point where then the big round is going to happen. So I just want to make sure people do realize that a lot of early stage companies are being funded, and they're being funded with smaller dollar amounts. I just think when you do look in the press, it's a lot more interesting to be talking about the $70 or $200 million Series A than it is the $5 million.
And those deals are not tranched. They're not disclosing the tranching of those deals.
Right.
Yeah. I have been asked by Sarah to announce that people should start submitting questions if they have them. And if you have a question, you go to Slido, SLIDO.com, and enter a code #BTS18. So it's on the screen. It's on my screen here and your screen there.
Ellen, also, I just want to comment. I agree that there's a variety of ways that early stage companies can also not just get capital, but sometimes it's about the team and the infrastructure and the know-how. And so we recently, we are investors in the Accelerator, Fund 4, and that's in New York and Seattle. It's led by Arch. And the idea here is a whole syndicate of investors, including 4 corporates, us, AbbVie, Pfizer, Lilly, as well as Arch and others, are members of this group. That then we source new co's that can either be led by entrepreneurs that we hire or by the Accelerator management team, and then we fund directly into those little companies. So we ran in at Janssen into folks at Case Western who had a really interesting science and a molecule, and rather than license it in, the concept was it would be great for them to be able to have a company. And so we presented that to the Accelerator, and now Rodeo Therapeutics was formed with a $7 million Series A with that syndicate of investors. And so there's a variety of interesting other models out there to access capital, and the other pieces that might be might be missing in terms of if you have interesting science but not everything else. So.
Right, and this isn't a particularly early stage focused panel, although it's hard for me not to go that direction. But it is the case that if it were, we'd be talking about things like how far you go on SBI or other grants, and how much opportunity there is for grant money now, notwithstanding what the general environment of the world feels like. And I think companies go a long way on those, and there is a lot of money in that space. And there's also a lot of money from, if you're in any kind of tech, not biotech necessarily, but med tech, or any kind of technology that needs a third party that might be a strategic, not a corporate venture partner, but maybe they have to provide a certain type of data, or maybe they have to provide a certain type of equipment, that you can look to those to be partners too, and sort of scrap together the early stage pieces. And in addition to accelerators, lots of cities, and I'm a big geography concerned person because I'm in New York and I want New York to be Boston. I call it the giant sucking sound of the North, for those of you old enough to remember Ross Perot. And New York's not going to be Boston, but it's better than it used to be. And we all know that most of the companies, in fact, if you look at the Silicon Valley report, most of these investments take place in, by far, the Boston area, and then Northern California second. So we all have to live with that, and not everybody's in those locations. So, but there are ways there, and even in the Midwest, there are lots of accelerators and incubators and university programs to help smaller companies.
But Ellen, to your point there on early stage, because it may affect many in the audience, what's also interesting is most of the universities now are doing a much better job, even with grants and the like, in what I would call the industrialization of tech transfer. So they're focused on better venture-ready assets, licensable-ready assets, that if we go into the university and want to start something, or an entrepreneur wants to pick up something, it's cleaned up much better. And that makes it easier for entrepreneurs to define kind of an early stage round to bring it forward.
I agree with that, and in fact, literally in the last month, I've had both someone at the University of Utah and somebody at a hospital in LA talk to me about potentially setting up tech transfer, and they're doing it for two reasons. They're doing it because it's good for their inventors and it's good for them. They get something out of it too, and so that is always a place to look. So, let's see, what have we not covered yet?
Here's a worry I have about large rounds. It'll be interesting to get your view. My worry is we're going to start seeing the money being deployed into bricks and mortar versus programs.
Where it used to be deployed too, is people build big labs and stuff.
And why?
Manufacturing.
Why, when we can deal with these accelerators or these virtual environments, or the Quintiles, or Acuvia, or the PPDs of the world, or in fact, it's interesting. I didn't realize that the Covance deal was positioned the way it is on your sponsor slide, where they've got the whole LabCorp structure around that. So, what's that?
No, that was my
Yeah, the whole LabCorp structure around it to keep a very virtual development model in place. So,
another topic is reverse mergers. So the whole concept that there's been a lot of IPOs. What was it? Something like 37 or something, 31 IPOs last year, which is huge. Given the beginning of the year, people were thinking, oh, there's a big slowdown, doom and gloom. But that being said, of those 31, they're not all going to be sky high. Some of them are going to be trading, right, just where flat, and some of them are just going to like drop. And there's clinical failures and a whole range of things. And so, with that, with that huge delta, the ones that aren't doing well are a great opportunity for Shell. And even though they're not doing well, a lot of them still have a lot of cash, especially with clinical failures. And so, when that happens, there is a competitive process where a lot of companies apply to be the candidate to match up with that reverse merger. So it's another interesting source of capital that's highly, highly competitive.
Yeah, let me just jump in. For those who aren't familiar with what a reverse merger is, it's a situation where there is a public company. It's typically in the biotech space one that has gone public with a program, but then that program fails. So it has money, but it doesn't have a program, and yet there's a private company that doesn't have money that has a program. So that private company will merge into the public company so that it supposedly gets liquidity, which is a big supposedly, because you don't necessarily have a stock market active environment that's interested in your company just because you merged with a dead public company. But that's the idea. It's been around a long time, and it happened. There was a lot of it in the mid-2000s. A lot. I don't know if there's as much now, but certainly.
Most of them that are getting done, they'll have cash. It's a failed program with
Yeah,
cash.
so it's a
Versus-
failed program with cash,
Yeah.
and then a company with a good program with no cash. That's what makes the marriage. There was one other area that has, I think, grown. Oh,
No, I just have some questions.
okay. I'll just throw out one other idea
Okay.
in case you all have comments or anybody has questions about it, and that's platform companies. And so that notion is you've got a platform. We all know you can have a technology that you create that has multiple uses. And what do you do with that? Do you put it all in one company? How do you house that? And I'll say, just from experience with one client over the last 2 years, which has been incredibly prolific, they started with a program basically just to spin out developed molecules as quickly as possible and turn them into drugs. And it turns out those are in completely disparate areas. Different potential buyers would be interested in different ones. And in fact, what happened was after 2 years, BMS came along and acquired the two oncology programs from this client, but the third program was in an NLRP3 inhibited and had nothing to do with the oncology side. So the company was restructured, which was not done as tax efficiently if we had gone in thinking about it that way, but no one was expecting that, so that asset could be retained by the investor group and the company, and the other two sold off. If you have a technology, even if you were the youngest company in the world, and this may seem like silly empire building, but if you have an asset that you truly think could have multiple complete disparate applications down the road, and that one party will be interested in it for one thing, one for another, and it's not exactly the same asset, it's a program where you're doing multiple molecules, then think from day one about setting up an LLC at the top, which has now become perfectly fine to do in the venture world. It doesn't all have to be a corporation in Delaware. It can be an LLC. It allows for money to flow through without tax implications, or very few tax implications. And then you stick all your management in a company beneath that, and they're going to management employees, and they service all the what I'll call boxes, and then set up a subsidiary for each program. And this is what Moderna did, which Astrazeneca is a major investor in. It's what Nimbus did, which Pfizer's a major investor in. In the case of Moderna, they've mostly set up different programs in different boxes, but the investors are pretty much, I believe, in all of them. In the case of Nimbus, right away they started setting up different programs and bringing in strategics at that level so that each company has a different cap structure. But it is something to give thought to. If you have a broad set of molecules that you're thinking of developing, that you might have different uses and different potential buyers and investors.
Okay, so we have questions. So let me start with the shortest one. Marion, Han spoke about his area of focus. What are your areas of focus?
Areas of focus. So JDDC invests in consumer device, and in the farm space, it's oncology, neuroscience, immunology, infectious diseases, and cardiovascular and metabolic. So, and there, it's on our website.
Thank you for that answer. Okay, moving on. With these large rounds being...
Want Han to answer the question too?
Well, he spoke to it already.
Okay.
He mentioned it, that's why somebody asked about Marianne's. So with these large rounds being raised, do you think we'll see more consolidations in specific therapeutic areas among biotechs, specifically in oncology and immuno-oncology?
One of the things I do want to point out about, at least that I've seen with these larger funds, and maybe John, I mean, you might have a view on this too, is because these funds, when they're that large, they have to put a certain amount of capital to work on each investment. One of the areas where I'm seeing a lot of VC money go into, which is even more than $100 million type of Series A, is actually kind of the structured financing of R&D for big pharma. And I think a lot of the big funds have at one point had a vehicle that they backed or come to me, probably in the last 2 days actually, looking for assets, late stage assets that they can fund. So how much of the numbers we're seeing for that you're reporting is actually based on funding for those types of opportunities? Like the Claris Fund, the recent one, $910 million is specifically for this.
Yeah, a significant part of that Claris Fund is focused on what maybe you can call defined exit, late stage, related to phase 3, to getting into approval with, earn out based on that. And I think that is a part of the financing we're seeing. If I had to estimate it as a percentage, I'd say probably 10%. So it's not the majority. The majority of what we're seeing is sort of early stage biotech investing.
So I think, back to the question, I think it'll be very difficult to see a lot of consolidation, I think, for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it doesn't usually make a ton of sense. I mean, say you have 2 immuno-oncology companies and each one is spending, I don't know, $80 million on R&D. If you put them together, yes, you're going to have one CEO instead of 2 and one CFO, but you're not going to save incrementally a huge amount of money. Also, you have the problem from the venture owner side is it's rare that we think anyone else's baby is as cute as our baby. So, and some people will bring out the diversification. Well, wouldn't you rather have 2 programs? We don't really need diversification at the fund level, right? I understand why companies want it, right? Because there's a high failure rate, and you want to be able to keep going. But we invest in multiple companies, and then our investors, the limited partners, are investing in multiple funds. So we don't need each company to diversify for us. There may be special situations where, whatever, I have a checkpoint inhibitor and you have an HDAC inhibitor, and really they would only work together, and let's do this right now. But I think that those will be the exceptions.
And I've seen it on rare occasion within a fund. So 2 microbiome companies, would combine because it makes sense, but not necessarily cross VC groups.
Yeah, and I think we also see, it's hard for biotech companies to die, and when you do have a failure,
They never die.
Typically, you have these large syndicates with a large amount of capital that's not only put in but reserved. That okay, what's next? If you don't already have another backup asset, then you're going to go out and license something. Typically there's a belief in the management and the belief in where they're going, and if the first one doesn't work out, it doesn't mean that the game's over.
Right. Art, did you want to say anything? No? Okay. So the next question from our audience is, can you comment on metabolic diseases, particularly in terms of therapeutic plays in the area? Given the regulatory cost associated with the sector, what does it look like in 2018?
Well, that goes back to the beauty, in part to why we invest in rare diseases. You can take a peptide therapeutic platform where we're not going to put the money in from the venture side, at least for a diabetes program. But if we could validate that platform in an orphan disease, which we can venture finance, then it gets to the answer in a different way. I think, at least for a fund like ours, or even, look, Intarcio is probably the first one that got truly financed in a major way. NEA, New Leaf were big players in that. A lot of it went into manufacturing, trial cost. It's not your typical venture play. So it's hard for me to see that play out unless it's a new platform of sorts.
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it depends, again, by the subset. Metabolic's big enough, but when we see an early stage type 2 diabetes idea, the idea that in early stage you're going to figure out what cardiovascular,
Right.
risk rate you're trying to guard against the 95% confidence interval, it's just very hard to figure out how much money is going to need to go into it. That makes it very hard to set the valuation, figure out the right syndicate, so it can be a tough one.
Okay, any other comments, Mary?
Well,
No?
I
No?
mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trials are big, they're huge, the drugs have to be incredibly safe, and there's just a handful of players who are willing to do that.
Right.
I mean, we obviously play in the diabetes space, but we're also interested in NASH, if you call that a metabolic disorder, which is, and that's a new sort of hot area, as one of the Nimbus axis was related to that. So I think there still is hope there, because clearly there's an unmet need. It's just a matter of having the right opportunity and having the right farmers who are willing to make that investment to see those into the marketplace.
Right, thank you. Yeah, it was covered on, we did a metabolic syndrome session, and that was covered in that as well. So our next question is, what solutions or technology are you seeing that have the potential to address the current challenges in clinical trials, both cost, time, success rate?
So
Well, I
we'll-
mentioned that earlier. That's, to me, a big opportunity here. The moving clinical trials into some kind of simulation and the like. I don't know if I've seen specific solutions. Have you?
So you can go on the web. Transcelerate, we're actually the founding members of that organization. Many of the big farmers are part of that, and it's about getting together to create those solutions. It's a nonprofit, and so that's one attempt to be able to get to those kind of streamlinings together rather than recreating the wheel.
In fact, there is another company like that, M2Gen, which is the Moffitt data, all the cancer data with Ohio State University. They have in silico silos and now the pharma companies are subscribing to it because they think they can help identify patient bases and accelerate a trial.
I mean, another thing that was brought up by somebody is the notion of sharing the control arms of, let's say, PD-1, because as we're doing all these studies, we're using patients for the same purpose, and whether or not I don't know if there's a way that you could either do trials collaboratively, or you could use a historic data for those. That's just one of the things that has been brainstormed, but there's not really a structure right now that I know of for people to come together and collaborate on those types of things.
Yeah, I think if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, boy, adaptive design has a lot of promise, and FDA is really talking about it in sort of merging phase 2, phase 3, or with a run-in. It hasn't really taken off. I mean, the statistics get complicated. I mean, it's more on the device side sometimes because you can make decisions more quickly. If you have a short timeline to your endpoint, the FDA is willing to let you use some Bayesian design criteria to revector dose arms or things like that, or endpoint design. But it's an area where it depends on which division of the FDA you're at, but the FDA is pretty conservative about too much fooling around in late stage trials. Early stage, they don't really care, but late stage, it's tough.
Okay, so our last question, and then we can wrap this up, Ellen, is where do you see the best biotech applications and impact for AI machine learning outside of diagnostics?
Outside of diagnostics?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well,
I guess you don't. No?
3D printing is a unique technology that could apply to multifaceted drug development off of films, off of these technologies, and that may start using AI as its platform. That's one example. I'm sure there's others, but
I think the concept of direct patient engagement with the pharma is something, as you're say using Remicade for your RA, and the notion of being able to understand like how that's working, how your day is, and the notion of using big data to really improve the patient experience is something I think that is part of the future.
And when we look at the DX tools sector, we sort of look at three different types. We have your DX test, sort of yes/no test. We have R&D tools that you sort of sell into big pharma and academia. Then we have DX analytics, which includes a lot of digital health companies. And I think that's where we've seen a surge of investment, specifically a lot of technology-focused investors are kind of coming into healthcare in those type of companies. We've seen a lot of investment in that sector. I think that's one of the more interesting areas where AI, machine learning can come into play in healthcare.
What about in discovery? No?
Some.
Yep.
Some, yeah.
Mhm.
That's where these 3D printing
Okay.
platform will come in. In fact, I remember Alex and I being on a panel a few years ago, and Marion, you may have been there too, where we were asked a question about platforms, and we said, we just won't invest in a platform. And that's changed a
We're
lot.
only, yeah.
Okay, here we.
I think a lot of the AI stuff will be for sort of lead generation or information. I think we're a ways away from saying, hey, we've validated that it gives you a higher likelihood of success. It's an enriched, more likely information. So I'm not sure it's game-changing in the near term for biotech. For things like pathology or something, maybe it's different.
So we just got an intriguing question that I think will be fun to answer from one of our audience members. If you could start a company right now, what kind of company would you start? What technology? What area?
I would start, we just did, an antifungal company.
Okay.
Big unmet medical need. It's the next wave.
Antifungal.
What's that? No, oral.
Alex, what would you do?
That's a tough one. We're actually, this is, orthogonal, but we're kind of interested in pharma services right now because so much money has gone into creation of all these companies. We think there's a real dearth of companies that can do very good sterile contract manufacturing for high-end products, especially emulsions or lyophilized cakes. So it's kind of blocking and tackling. It's not as sexy as this stuff, but I think that's that's back to the being in San Francisco, the people who get rich in a gold rush are the people who are selling picks and shovels. So that's
okay,
probably
so
where we
that's
would
what
focus.
excites you. Okay.
Anti-infectives for me.
Anti-infectives. Okay, John. Marion, what do you think? What would you do if you could? Anything?
I think the concept of digital therapeutics is really fascinating. So, and it sort of is, it's in this valley where people don't understand how they might work. In other words, things that can help to treat pain, let's say, with virtual reality, or autism, or depression, with whether or not it's interacting with games or visuals. That whole concept that is of digital therapeutics, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah, I know we had really great presentations over at our digital medicine conference, which is still going on, actually. Han, what would you do if you could? Anything you wanted in this space?
Probably maybe a transfection company. I think what's holding back a lot of these, even like the CRISPR type technologies, even some of the Moderna RNAi has always been transfection. I think that's been the crux, which I think should have been tackled first, because to deliver these, they're not small molecules necessarily, they're not proteins necessarily, but to deliver these other nucleotides, for instance, into the cells, I think is, in my view, kind of the holy grail.
I know you weren't going to ask me, but I'll answer
No,
the
no, I
question.
actually do want to ask you, Ellen. You
First
sit,
of all, if I start a company, I should probably be the lawyer and not the scientist.
yeah, but you sit over all of this. You see so much coming in.
But
So
I
if
will
you
say,
had your option,
having been at a Pfizer women's breakfast this morning and heard the head of rare and orphan diseases talk, I'm in for rare and orphan diseases. It was the most inspiring thing I've ever heard. So that's what I would do. I haven't picked the one, but it would be one.
okay, wonderful.
No,
So
part-
Ellen, it's go ahead.
What
Art.
Marion said is in the pain area, this whole opioid crisis is going to kick off a number of new innovations that we should be paying attention to.
Yeah, I don't think we've had enough companies that have focused on that specific asset at this conference. I know it's a really challenging, error-fraught area. So, Ellen, any other questions for your panelists?
that wraps it up for me if there are none others here. And
Okay, so from my point of view, I want to thank everybody, Ellen included. So Alex, Art, John, Marion, and Han, thank you very much for joining Ellen in this discussion. And a reminder that we come back here at 4:30 for the journalist wrap-up. I think we have 8 journalists who will be here to talk about what was seen and heard around Union Square and the Hilton this week. So join us then. In the meantime, thank you all.